Today I am summarizing the book Steve Jobs. The author of the book is Mr. Walter Isaacsom, who is a writer, professor, and former CEO of CNN. All of these people have one thing in common. They are all great people who have changed the world. Steve Jobs hopes to become one of these great people and scholars. He invited Walter Isaacsom to write the book. Steve Jobs is probably the most successful businessman in the world. In 1997, he released his commercial Think Different, which featured documentary videos of some of the greatest figures in history: Albert Einstein, Martin Luther King Jr., Muhammad Ali, Thomas Edison, and Mahatma Gandhi. These superhumans had unusual perspectives and saw the world differently than ordinary people, which is why they were able to change the world. Like them, Steve Jobs is one of the greatest people in history. In 2004, Steve Jobs met with the author and asked him to write the book. 5 years later, Steve Jobs' wife came to see him again, only to find out that in 2004, when Steve Jobs approached him to write the book, he had already been diagnosed with early-stage cancer. Steve Jobs was working on a new Apple product while he was being treated for cancer. During his time with cancer, Apple products were booming. The company launched the iPod and introduced the next-generation iPhone smartphone to the world. It wasn't until 2009 that Walter agreed to write the book. Steve Jobs has an amazing story. He started Apple with his friends in his parents' garage in 1976, but unfortunately, he was fired from the board of directors of his own company in 1985. 11 years later, he and a few of his former employees founded the computer software company Next. He also bought the animation company Pixar Animation Studio, and later became a world-renowned filmmaker. After Steve Jobs left Apple to operate Next, the company began to decline from year to year. In 1997, he was invited back to lead Apple. In just 14 years, Steve Jobs has gone from bankruptcy to becoming the most valuable company in the world, with its value increasing by more than 700 times. He is a person who has made a difference in the fields of technology, computers, mobile phones, the internet, music, and entertainment. He is a person who has made a difference in innovation and creativity. To write this book, the author met with Steve Jobs more than 40 times and interviewed countless friends, relatives, and colleagues. The book was published 19 days after Steve's death and became the latest historical documentary on the true history of Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs has always compared himself to Thomas Edison, but what the two of them do not have in common is that Steve Jobs did not make any major discoveries. Computers were not invented by Apple, nor were computer mice. He was not the inventor of the digital music player, which was invented in Singapore. However, what Steve Jobs discovered and what made him special was his talent for finding and creating innovative value for the production of electronics to be more widely used and in a more user-friendly form. He redesigned those products from drawing, creating, assembling, adjusting, and refining them until they became perfect products. He tried to persuade, inspire, praise, blame, and guide millions of people to create products that could relate to people's daily lives, be put in a pocket, bag, or on a table. Those who have used Apple products will be proud of this product because of its uniqueness, but behind the production and design, whether it is software or hardware, all go through failure and effort for many years. Some people see Steve Jobs as a great founder and a role model. Others see him as a great competitor, while still others say that he was a dictator with no emotions and no understanding of others. What kind of person was Steve Jobs? Where did his creativity, misconceptions, and motivations behind his actions and struggles come from? Where did he find the faith that allowed him to do so many wonderful things? Why was he a manager who had no emotions, spoke deceptively, and did not care about the feelings of others? How did his true character affect the Apple products he created? When it comes to the history of celebrities in the world, most of them did not have a glorious beginning. Most of them were born into ordinary families, had different personalities, but had big ambitions and went through failures, injustice, and contempt before they achieved success in their lives. Steve Jobs was no different. Below, we summarize the main points of this book. We divide the book into 3 parts. The first part tells the story of Steve Jobs before he founded Apple. What made him grow up in such a big way that he began to see the world in a different light. In the second part, we talk about the relationship between Steve Jobs' character and the products he created. How did his selfishness, oppression, temper, and desire for perfection affect Apple? In the third part, we look at Steve Jobs' transformation and the gradual maturation of him and Apple. What storms and obstacles did he face during his 11 years away from Apple, and what lessons can we learn from him? Let us get to the first point. As a child, Steve Jobs was influenced by two important things in his life. First, the fact of his abandonment and adoption by his parents. Steve Jobs was born in 1955, abandoned by his biological parents and adopted by a middle-class couple. Despite their humble employment and educational backgrounds, they provided Steve Jobs with the best of both worlds in terms of upbringing and education. Steve Jobs learned about his adoption when he was about 6 years old. His classmates laughed at him when he told them, and Steve Jobs was devastated. However, his adoptive parents reassured him that he was not the one who was abandoned, but rather that they had chosen him. Steve Jobs also told the author about the unforgettable kindness of both of his adoptive parents. Whether or not he was aware of it, the story of his childhood may have had a profound impact on how he felt. However, what we do know is that being abandoned and adopted created two conflicting personas within him. The first persona was very self-controlled, both in terms of action and emotion. He was like a robot. The second persona made him realize that he was a special person. He was always breaking the rules and doing things that no one had ever done before. He refused to conform to the norms of society. He was stubborn and opinionated. He loved his adoptive parents, but he expressed his love in excessive ways. He insisted on attending a private school, even though it was very expensive. When his parents could not afford it, he dropped out of school but still stood outside the classroom and listened to the lessons. The way Steve Jobs communicated with his family was similar to the way he lived his life and worked with his team, friends, and employees. He always made bold proposals, which seemed impossible and even a little exaggerated. In 1960, when Steve Jobs was 5 years old, his parents moved to a neighborhood in southern San Francisco, California, where he grew up. The San Francisco Bay Area in the 1960s was a hub and homeland of commerce, music, sports, culture, and technology in the United States. Steve Jobs' childhood was at a time when Santa Clara was transforming from an agricultural city into a thriving electronics industry, and the United States was one of the richest powers in the world. This led to a lot of money and resources being poured into the development of the area, which later became a major area of rapid growth. In 1971, the area was renamed Silicon Valley. This was a privilege for Steve Jobs, a young boy who grew up in an area that had made great strides in technology. From an early age, he loved physics, mathematics, and science, and joined many clubs to learn more. He also loved music and sports. He said that what kept him energized was not the spirit of adventure, but the careful exploration of new discoveries. He traveled to India and stayed there for 7 months. When he returned to the United States, he said that he had learned about the crazy culture of the West. He said that it was important to be able to wake up and use the intelligence that comes from experience to achieve great things. Walter Isaacsom says that some people love the art of music and some people love technology. These two groups of people are often difficult to talk to or communicate with. However, in the case of Steve Jobs, he was a technical person who loved the art of music and was passionate about both. This was Steve Jobs' natural gift. Steve Jobs' idol was Edwin H. Land, the founder of Polaroid camera maker. At several Apple product launches, Steve Jobs used a photo of 4 intersections on one street artist, one street technician, and one businessman. He stood in the middle of the 4 intersections, hoping that Apple would also be in this position. All of Apple's products, whether the interior, the unique design, or their simple yet stylish design, are all a combination of art and technology. When Steve Jobs was in this position, the world often looked at him as an outsider. However, fortunately, he grew up in Silicon Valley. This is a place where people know that only such people can create miraculous achievements. Here is an example that will help you understand this. When Steve Jobs was 13 years old, he joined an adventure club founded by HP. He needed a small piece of equipment to test, so he called the CEO of HP at the time, Bill Hewlett. The CEO not only answered his phone, but he also talked to him for up to 20 minutes. He gave Steve Jobs the parts he needed and gave him a 2-week internship. This gave Steve Jobs more self-confidence in technology and helped him to make his mark on Silicon Valley. Next, we come to the second point, the relationship between Steve Jobs' innate character and the products he created. Steve Jobs was a complex person. No one in the world knew him well, not even himself. He loved art and design, etc. But he was also arrogant, selfish, and wanted what he wanted, regardless of how others felt. Many people say that Apple products are the shadow of Steve Jobs. How can this be understood? The authors suggest that, in fact, Apple and its products really reflect Steve Jobs' personality. And because he was a perfectionist who did not care about others, that is why Apple was able to produce the perfect products that you all use today. This may be related to Steve Jobs' childhood. His adoptive father was a mechanical engineer when he was a child. He was taught by his father that everything must be done carefully, even if no one sees it. This is the most basic profession of an engineer. From the time he started building the first generation of Apple computers with his friend Steve Wozniak in his parents' garage, to the creation of the iPod, iPhone, and iPad, Steve Jobs remained committed to his philosophy of perfection. Everything he created had to be perfect for him to be happy. Whether it affected production costs, put a lot of pressure on the team, or made others see him as a selfish psychopath, he would not compromise his principles. For example, when he was officially launching the iPhone, he threw the phone in front of the audience when it took too long to turn on. He told his engineers that people would only use the phone for a short time, so it had to turn on in less than 10 seconds. The engineers said it was impossible, but Steve Jobs insisted that it had to be done. Another example is when he released the second-generation Macintosh. He had the motherboard disassembled because there was a crooked wire. He wanted everything to be perfect, even the smallest details. When he created the Macintosh and the first generation of the iMac, he spent a lot of time designing the fonts. He even took his team of engineers to a bean factory to see how they created the bean color he wanted for the next generation of iMac cases. In the final stages of his cancer, he was hospitalized and refused to wear a mask. He said the mask was too ugly and he didn't want to wear it. He also didn't like the way the IV suspension was attached to his arm. He asked the doctor to design a new system that was cleaner and easier to use. Steve Jobs had a bad habit of wanting others to do things exactly as he thought they should be done. If he didn't like something, he would change it. For example, he originally wanted the first Macintosh computer to have only 2 slots, but his partner Steve Wozniak refused. In the end, Steve Wozniak put up to 8 slots on the computer. Since then, Steve Jobs has been obsessed with creating simple and perfect products. The iPhone has no buttons other than the home button. The iPod Shuffle has no screen, only front and back buttons and a stop button. Apple products are designed to be difficult to repair. The internal components cannot be easily opened and accessed without special tools or the assistance of a professional repair technician. This is a deliberate decision by Apple. Steve Jobs believed that if his products were too easy to repair, people would not take care of them as well. He wanted his products to be seen as works of art that should be cherished. Whether it was Microsoft in the 1980s or Google today, they have adopted a different approach. They have created open platforms that allow anyone to participate. For example, anyone can create Android apps or search for information on Google. Steve Jobs did not believe in this approach. He believed that it would lead to the creation of inferior products. He wanted to create the best products possible, and he was not willing to compromise on quality. Steve Jobs' perfectionism was both his strength and his weakness. It drove him to create some of the most innovative products of our time, but it also made him difficult to work with. Despite his flaws, Steve Jobs was a visionary who changed the world. His legacy will continue to inspire people for generations to come. Steve Jobs had a belief that no one could change him. He believed that he was a special person, like Einstein or Mahatma Gandhi. The existing rules and principles in the world did not suit him, so he had to create new ones for himself and others to follow. He always violated the laws of nature, and when the truth was different from what he thought, he refused to accept it. We see a lot of successful companies and ideas come from one person or a piece of paper. Some things seem impossible until they become a reality that everyone marvels at and makes a big difference in history. People who used to work with Steve Jobs admit that working with him was very stressful. But it was because of these pressures that they were able to do things beyond their means and achieve incredible results. At one point, when deciding on the final design of the Macintosh computer, Steve Jobs held an unofficial launch with his team of engineers. He had the names of all the engineers engraved on the motherboard of the Macintosh so that no one could easily open it and see the inside. This was one of his ways of motivating and guiding his team. The Macintosh was a very popular computer, and its design and operating system were very different from any other computer that had come before it. However, because Steve Jobs wanted it to be small, thin, and simple, he decided to remove some unnecessary parts. For example, he didn't want the Macintosh to have a CD-ROM drive, which made it run slower. He also didn't want it to have a fan, which made it overheat and crash. The Macintosh was also more technologically advanced and sophisticated than Windows computers, but Windows was more user-friendly, especially in terms of hardware and software. Microsoft also had partnerships with many components manufacturers around the world, such as Intel. The board of directors was not satisfied with Steve Jobs' business model, but Steve Jobs always adhered to his principles. This disagreement led to Steve Jobs being fired from the board of directors of his own company. After being fired from Apple, Steve Jobs founded Next, a computer company. He also bought Pixar Animation Studios. In these 11 years, he learned a lot and changed a lot. He became more open to other people's ideas and began to recognize that his ideas were not always right. He also became more patient and self-controlled. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, he brought with him the lessons he had learned from his experience at Next and Pixar. He also brought a new vision for Apple. He wanted to create a company that made simple, elegant products that were easy to use. He also wanted to create a company that was innovative and creative. Under Steve Jobs' leadership, Apple became one of the most successful companies in the world. It introduced products like the iPod, iPhone, and iPad, which changed the way people lived and worked. Steve Jobs' vision and determination made Apple the company it is today. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this summary of the book Steve Jobs, the biography.